begin. The session's being recorded. So let me step back for a moment and just say, in our classes, so most of us here are economics instructors, and in our classes, I think I speak for everyone saying what we're doing is we're trying to prepare our students for post-college life. And we try to do that by teaching them a set of tools that they can use in their work and in their everyday life. Okay. These include theoretical tools like supply and demand and maximizing expected utility or profit, game theory. These are all ideas that I think about pretty often. And empirical tools like t-tests and regression models and instrumental variables, all of which we've seen in presentations at this conference. And we often give them chances to use those tools with real data to answer questions and give us new insights onto kind of real world things. Okay, but what we don't spend a huge amount of time on, I think, is teaching students how to communicate our findings to their peers, and maybe even more important, to a broader audience. Sometimes I'll say to my students, explain something to me, and then they use all of the economics jargon that I teach them. And then I say, no, imagine that you're talking to your dad and he's not an economist. How would you explain that? Or a grandparent, how would you explain it to a grandparent? Okay. Now, our panelists today come from government and private industry, which I'm really excited about because I think it's really, really important to get outside perspectives. On the other hand, they're all trained economists, so it's not like we're getting really outside perspectives here. But they do have experience that most of us, I think, don't have. Okay. And all three of them spend a huge amount of their time communicating economic results to outside audiences, okay? Telling stories using economic data. Now, many of you know Diego Mendez Carbajo from his presentations at conferences around the world. Diego works at the US Fed, and he works on helping us as instructors use Fed data in our classes. Rose Tan is also here from LinkedIn. She was a student of mine when we were both at Yale, and she got a PhD in economics from Stanford, and now she's a senior data scientist at LinkedIn. And then Thomas Viegas was a student of Clodagh Jenkins, who's one of the organizers of this conference, and he was her student when they were both at UCL. Okay, Thomas is now a manager in market intelligence at the Bank of England. You know, just yesterday, Clodagh and I were talking in the mixer. See, there's another plug for the mixer. The mixers are great. We were talking about how proud we are of both Thomas and Rose, and how much we love seeing our students go on and become really successful, and how that's actually one of the most rewarding parts of our job. And so we're both pretty excited that they're on the panel today. So Diego's going to start. He's going to tell us how the Fed helps us teach students analysis and communication of that analysis. And then Rose and Thomas are going to talk about their experiences using data to inform policy and strategy. And then we'll open up the discussion to the whole group. So I encourage you to post your questions in the Q&A. And if you see questions in the Q&A you like, definitely give them the thumbs up, and I'll make sure to pass them on. We're gonna do the 3 presentations and then have our freewheeling discussion right after that. And so take it away, Diego.
Thank you, Doug. So the title of my brief presentation to frame how is it that we help consumers of economic data in Fred use that data and make stories and tell the story behind the numbers, is organized around a new initiative that we're launching of offering a micro credential on data literacy. So Doug mentioned, I'm a trained economist. Hold the position of senior economic education specialist at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis after spending 19 years of teaching economics at the college level. And whatever I say today is my opinion and does not represent the official views of the Federal Open Market Committee, the Federal Reserve System, or the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. So many of you, if not most of you, have heard about FRED. And this is what we tell people who are new to FRED. FRED is a data aggregator. FRED stands for Federal Reserve Economic Data. It has more than 800,000 time series from over 100 different sources. And those include governments, treaty organizations, as well as private organizations. FRED enables users to find, download, graph, map, and understand economic and financial data. And I'm showing you two examples of data visualizations that you can create through FRED. One is the time series graph of any of the 800,000 time series that are in FRED. And the second one is a map of the US where you can create graphical representations of the spatial distribution of data by plotting those data in a map. Data on FRED are also available across many platforms, not only the FRED website that most people are familiar with, but as well as an API, an Excel add-in, and a mobile app. There are also third-party modules to use FRED data in statistical software and programming languages, including Excel, Stata, and R. So you can get the FRED data into your statistical analysis at the click of a button. Users can create a free user account to save graphs that automatically update with the latest data. So these are not static representations of data. Data in FRED updates regularly, and where new data become available, the website reflects that. And through a FRED account, you can create data lists for bulk download, as well as design dashboards with customized graphs and data that can be made public. FRED is featured in economics textbooks, used by journalists, and is relied upon by millions of people across the world as a free, trusted data source. Over 1/3 of FRED users come from outside of the US. And in 2020, there were 7.8 million website users, not sessions, 7.8 million website users that generated 15.6 million sessions alone. 33% of the users engage with the FRED graph, demonstrating a desire to understand the data. So they manipulate, 1/3 of the users manipulate the data in a FRED graph. So to help these consumers, these users of FRED, these consumers of data, make more of the information available through FRED, we launched a pilot program on data literacy, and we're targeting initially librarians. The research division at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis is widely known for its flagship data service, FRED. And an integral part of our work facilitating access to data is building capacity among consumers to use data effectively and accurately. So we're launching a micro-credential, a short competency-based recognition of professional recognition that allows an individual to demonstrate mastery in a particular area. Frequently visible in social media as digital badges, micro-credentials offer employers the opportunity to evaluate a potential employee in terms not only of the resume or the cover letter, but also based on a more granular body of skill sets and experiences. Micro-credentials have been around for a long time. Depending on the institution that you work at and your professional background, you might be more or less familiar with them. They were a new discovery for me, but I've seen they've been around for the best part of a decade and is considered mainstream in many fields. So what the St. Louis Fed did is we researched this topic, and we figured out that we will contract the services of a third party to issue the badges, to create the badges, to display the badges, and that party is Credly. And on our part, we design a fully asynchronous course where we scaffold the development of skills from the users. Each of the modules that we offer to the students who are telling stories with data involve a knowledge check on data literacy skills. We give them opportunities for practice through the FRED website to create and read graphs. Then we give them 2 problem-solving scenarios related to data literacy, and we present them with a transfer opportunity where they apply the skills that they developed related to the FRED site to other data sources. To complete these modules, 80% satisfactory work has to be completed. So we host the course in Canvas. We have that Data Literacy for Librarians program launched in December of 2021. There are modules in Canvas for each of 7 separate data literacy competencies that we are developing. Each of the modules involves or includes those knowledge checks, hands-on practices, problem-solving scenarios, and a transfer activity that I described earlier. We have mapped those badges, those competencies to associates to information literacy frames from the Association of College and Research Libraries. So we're grounding our competencies in the skills that are recognized professionally by the librarians. When the librarians complete the 7 badges in the program, they receive recognition in the form of a micro-credential. So it looks something like this. Each of those 7 badges that you have seen around the page are individual skills related to data literacy. When the 7 of them are completed, the participant receives the micro-credential on data literacy for librarians. So what is it that we have done so far? I'm just going to present some metrics for what we found on this work and wrap it up. So since December 2021, we have 740 people registered. 560 of those have enrolled in the Canvas course, and 184 are active participants in the program. We have 144 people completed modules to the tenor that as of today, or as of last Friday, we have awarded 752 badges related to data literacy. Most of the participants in this program come from colleges and universities. They come from the EDU space, but we also have a number of people coming from government organizations or public agencies. Therefore, there you see the .gov and the .org email domains. The nice thing about these badges is that they're visible in social media. So we are magnifying the visibility of this program by getting the recipients of these badges to display them in social media channels, such as LinkedIn, as you can see here. We provide the participants for opportunities for feedback when they complete the course, the program, and what we're hearing is very positive feedback on the mix of hands-on activities through FRED and reading materials. The opportunities to practice are broadly approved and celebrated. And we're getting some very positive feedback in terms of presenting a blueprint or a potential blueprint for continuing this kind of skill development, competency-based professional development in other areas related to data literacy. Anybody can register and participate in the program. We're not screening for librarians specifically. So that's the link. You are more than welcome to join us and participate. And with that, I will stop.
Thank you, Diego. That was great. And I'm excited for the discussion where I'm sure people are going to have questions about the program. And yeah, because I know I do. But we're going to hold questions until the end. So next up, Rose is going to talk about her experience telling stories with data, certainly at LinkedIn, but maybe even more than that. You're up, Rose.
All right, thanks, Doug. I will be talking about how data, especially econometrics, is used to tell stories at LinkedIn. So my name is Rose Tan. I work at LinkedIn. There's my LinkedIn profile up there if you want to reach me later. So before we go into economics, we can back up one step and talk about how data is used at LinkedIn. And it's used pretty much everywhere all the time for almost every decision the company makes. And it comes in several different forms, of which I'll highlight 3 here. The first is raw data. And so raw data, you can think about something like the number of job applies or the number of members LinkedIn has. And so these are various dashboards of different business metrics that anyone at the company can easily access. Another variation of raw data is taking that data and then processing it and then releasing it to the general public, similar to government statistics, but typically at a higher time interval. And so, for example, the LinkedIn hiring rate may be available on a monthly or even weekly basis. And so that's kind of like a public good that can be provided from the underlying data that LinkedIn has. The second category are prediction problems. And so prediction problems, one example is forecasting various business metrics. And so the researchers at LinkedIn have put together a gray kite forecasting package, for example. And another variation of these prediction problems are machine learning recommendation algorithms. And so, for example, if you go on LinkedIn to look for a job, you'll see a lot of different job recommendations that are powered by machine learning. A third class of problems are causal inference problems. And so, for example, A/B testing. And so the classic example of A/B testing is I have a green button and I have the same website, but with a blue button. And I give half my members the green button, half the blue, and I look at some outcome variable like engagement afterwards. And so that's used very widely. And so pretty much every feature that's launched goes through this A/B testing process. And then if we think about A/B testing as doing causal inference using experimental data, we have the counterpart, which is doing causal inference using observational data. And so that's what I will talk more about today. So how is causal inference used? For example, we have this actually an internal causal inference platform. And so this platform, what it does is it makes it easier for people who to do these different methods like instrumental variables or panel data or inverse propensity score weighting. The specific version we have is doubly robust, and it allows them to do this in a replicable way with certain guardrails in place in a way that makes these methods more accessible to people. And also provides the appropriate set of guardrails compared to someone just kind of opening a notebook like a Jupyter notebook and just starting to code. And so it provides a little bit more structure and guidance and tries to almost provide like a cookbook for these different methods. And then there's also more customized or ad hoc methods that have been developed. For example, in two-sided marketplaces, we often have circumstances where SUTVA is violated, and there's a lot of interference and spillover effects and such. And so in the creator viewer marketplace, the researchers at LinkedIn have developed a method called ego clusters to mitigate the impact of network effects, or to explicitly measure the impact from network effects. Just to make everything more concrete, I'll run through this cute little fake example with you of instrumental variables. So let's say that LinkedIn is launching a new feature where members can customize the color of their profile background by changing some setting. And so, for example, here you see that this background color is gray. This is the profile of Satya Nadella, who is the CEO at Microsoft, which owns LinkedIn. And so you can imagine that members now have the option, instead of having this, nice, boring gray background, they can do funky colors like blue or red, or and so on. And this is kind of, the example is going to sound a little absurd because it's very contrived, but there are similar things that are actually happening within the company. And so let's say I run an A/B test where I inform half of these members, okay, hey, look, check out our new feature where you can change your profile background. And half the members do not get that information. Now, keep in mind that the number of members who may actually want to take up this treatment of changing the background may be relatively small relative to the entire population of all members. And so if I run an A/B test, I may actually find that there's no statistically significant difference between the treatment and control groups in terms of the information, because the treatment is, there's very little take up of it. And so the treatment effect is diluted. And so this is a circumstance where you can use instrumental variables to isolate the impact for just the people who actually did take up the treatment and change their profile color. And so here, for instrumental variables, are Y, the outcome variable, can be some metric of engagement. Z, the instrument, is an A/B experiment. It's really nice to be able to run experiments that are 100% randomized and then use them as instruments, because then you don't worry about, with rainfall, is it really random, or birth quarter, and those. And so it's nice to have actual random variation as the instrument. You still have to be careful about, the other assumptions of IB, and the exclusion restriction remains tricky. And then X, the endogenous variable here, is changing their profile color settings. And you can tell yourself the story for, why might X be endogenous. Suppose, for example, there are a group of members like job seekers. They engage more on LinkedIn, but they're also more likely to go into their settings and play around with them. And they're also, because that means that they're more likely to change their profile color, they're also more likely to have higher engagement. And so if we, ignored the endogeneity, we would falsely conclude that people who change their profile color also have more engagement because of the unobserved confounding factor of job seekers. And so what do we find? These are our fake results. Let's say we do the IB, and it's like, oh, wow, members who change their profile color actually have 10% more engagement. This is amazing. Our stakeholder, which is just jargon for the person who is invested and cares about the outcome of our analysis. Typically, this is a product manager within tech companies. They will be really happy to learn about this 10%. But first, they have to actually understand our analysis. And so, the part that I think is covered very rigorously within the academic curriculum is, okay, like, how do we run this instrumental variable? How do we make sure all the assumptions are satisfied? How do we, what does that parameter actually mean? And like, how, are we doing two-stage least squares? And are we putting in all our control variables in the right places? And I think, that category of technical questions and methodological rigor, I think is covered very thoroughly within the academic curriculum. And then there's this other component that I found I had less training in, and I sort of was just figuring it out as I went along, which is how do we share these findings and communicate them within the company while remaining faithful to the methodology, its primary shortcomings and caveats. For in the example of instrumental variables, we know that the treatment effect, for example, only applies to the complier group. If I tell that though to my product manager, who is not an economist and may not have a very technical background, it will just confuse them and they won't retain that piece of information. In the particular case of IV, what I've ended up doing is I have a slide with an actual picture of like a fence, and I have some people to the left of the fence who are the never takers, and the way I explain it is that, you know, no matter what you do, they will never do the thing that you want them to do. And then there are people on the other side of the fence who are always takers, and I frame those as, okay, those are people who, you know, basically came on the website to go change your settings and the profile color. No matter what you do, they will always do that. And then there are people who are literally sitting on the fence, and those are the people whose decisions you have the opportunity to change. And if they get in this particular example, if they get the reminder to, hey, go check out this new setting, they will do it. And if they don't, then they won't go. They won't change their profile color. And I found that's been helpful just to give people something to grasp onto, especially a visual image, which I realized my particular slide deck is very short of. So yeah. The other thing is, I found it's been helpful to present the results in the format of a story so that it's easy to understand as well as remember. Because not only does the product manager need to understand what the results from my analysis, they actually need to retain that information with enough accuracy and depth of understanding to explain it to their manager as well as all of their partners. And so wrapping it in the form of a story helps solidify what it actually means. And so the story, this is a contrived example, but oftentimes the story is something like, hey, look, maybe members didn't know that this particular setting about changing their profile color existed. And so when we like sent them this encouragement, they're like, oh, wow, I didn't know this thing existed before. And those are the people who now benefit from going to change it, and they're happier by 10% because they now have this more customized profile. And so depending on the circumstance, it can be both challenging, but as well as instructive for me personally to think about the methodology outside of the context of all of the economics jargon that is normally surrounded with, like, oh, the treatment effect for the complier group is 10%, and decompose that to what does that actually mean from like a first principles perspective. And so a couple of lessons I wanted to share. I think the first is just that data is a first-class citizen in modern tech companies. Everything revolves around data. And the second is that, you know, for most large companies, they have very robust experimentation platforms to do A/B testing. And it's typically very, very, very effective. But there are certain circumstances when you might not be able to run an A/B test. For example, you know, whether for legal reasons or because it's a bad member experience, you can't force the member to take some action. You can only encourage them to. And so generally that's like a great setting for using instrumental variables. And then there's also other settings where there are causal questions that can't be answered using experiments. And so causal inference using observational data can be very powerful in these circumstances where for whatever reason we can't run an experiment. However, these methods also need more expertise. And so I think this is, you know, awesome that we have this amazing groups of economists who care about teaching students these methods, because the the expertise is actually quite specialized and valuable, and it's not the type of expertise that someone with a different kind of training, even someone who did like a master's in data science or, you know, an advanced degree in computer science, like machine learning engineers, they have a different type of training that is also super useful, but economists have this complementary type of training. And then the next one is for the results of the analysis to really make an impact and not just be a report that gathers dust in the corner. It really needs to be understandable to a general audience, and stories are what's most memorable. And so, and ironically, you know, being able to tell a good story that is faithful to the shortcomings of the methodology, it actually requires a deeper understanding of the methodology than just being able to use the typical econ jargon shorthand to communicate, where the actual substance of the matter can be obscured by the jargon. Here, it's like you can't, there's no room for obscurity here, and you're really trying to drive at this extreme clarity of what this result actually means and where it applies and where it doesn't apply and why we observe it. But all communicated in a way to someone who doesn't actually share my academic background. And so it's really forced me to get to the core of what the methodology can and can't do. And I think that's something that, you know, it might be interesting to try out in the classroom. And as Doug said in the beginning, you know, like forcing the students to explain it in a way to subtract all the jargon, so you can't rely on that crutch to obscure the clarity of the ideas. Finally, for all of the links in the slides, I've put the URLs here as a reference. Some of these are blog posts, some of them are short papers, and there's also a YouTube video on causal inference in there. And that's it from me.
Thank you, Rose. Super eye-opening. And I think so many people just really throw around the word data science. Data science is important. And some people see that as, oh, I should study data science instead of econometrics. And like, data science includes so much of econometrics. Like data science is like, yeah, you need to know how to set up the data using things like Python and scrape the web. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, you should know some machine learning. But that doesn't mean all the causal inference stuff that we teach in our classes is useless. In fact, it's just as important as it always has been. Thank you. All right, so next up we have Thomas, and I see lots of good questions coming in the chat or coming in the Q&A, and there's good stuff in the chat too. If you wanna make sure that I don't miss it, throw it in the Q&A, and I'll make sure that that we talk about it afterward. Otherwise, it's much easier to manage the Q&A than it is the chat. All right, Thomas, give us your take.
Thanks so much, Douglas. Just to check before I start, can you see the slides okay? Okay, perfect. Well, thank you very much. And thank you to the organizers as well for this brilliant conference so far. And I think, you know, from what we've already heard from Diego and Rose, this is such a brilliant topic, I think, to round up what you would have heard from the conference. And indeed, I think to do justice in 1.5 hours is a big ask, but here we go anyway. So first, my name is Thomas Viegas. As Douglas mentioned, I work at the Bank of England, and so I'll just start with a disclaimer that anything I say from here is my own personal view and not of that of the bank or any other organization. But I think what Diego and Rose have given are really great tangible examples, and I'm probably have the luxury of going last. So I'm going to step back a little bit, zoom out a little bit, and give you a bit about my experience and kind of broader lessons I've learned kind of post-classroom in terms of this topic. But to start with, before getting into how to tell economic stories, I wanted to tell you my story with economics. So growing up, as maybe some of you on the call have as well, growing up through the end of the Great Moderation, or the so-called Great Moderation, And I've really started to, start to look at economics, think about economics at the onset of the global financial crisis. As kind of Wall Street over the pond was starting to collapse, and also kind of closer to home, bank disruptions and fiscal bailouts, they all became the jargon of the day. And so that was really where I was kind of really hit in the face with what economics and constant stories in the media about what was going on. And I really think that spearheaded my desire to go and study economics, to understand it, so much so that I went to study it twice, as an undergraduate and a postgraduate, just because the first time around I think I didn't get the answers that I necessarily was looking for, or maybe I wasn't looking closely enough. And so kind of armed with some, and I'll underscore the word some, knowledge, methods and tools, I went off to the Bank of England, and like many people, wanting to go off and make a difference after having studied the science that you fall in love with. And what I found there, as I think Diego and Rose have highlighted brilliantly, is the importance of storytelling. Storytelling in terms of what you do in your work, but then also most importantly, how you communicate your work. There's millions of students around the world that will do exceptional economic work, both in terms of the micro and macro, but unless you can communicate that, you're working in a vacuum. And so it's really important that you're able to tell a really convincing narrative. And already, as the presentations before me have shown, economics is absolutely everywhere, whether you're looking for data in terms of US mortgage rates on Fred, or whether you're looking for that next job on LinkedIn. Economics is everywhere. And as many of you know from studying it, through teaching it, it can often be very messy. And so part of a job as of an economist, one would think, is to put some order and structure around what we see. And so understanding what's going on in my job or my career to date has been critical to inform economic policy at the Bank of England. The Bank of England is the central bank of the United States.
Can everyone else hear Thomas? All right, it seems that Thomas's internet connection has frozen. Thomas, if you can hear us, maybe log out and log back in again. I have an undergraduate computer science degree, so I know that's how you're supposed to fix things, is turn them off and on again. Let's see. I guess while we're waiting for Thomas, let me ask Diego a couple questions from the chat. So Parama would like to know, Diego, is the credentialing system that you described open to people in other countries, or is it just the US? And kind of what's the skill level that you expect people to have coming in? Like, what level is it pitched at?
So those two questions. So is it open to people from outside of the United States? Absolutely. We're not screening the origin of the participants, and we have people completing the credentials from all over the world. So you are, or all of you are welcome to join, regardless of where you're based. And I'm sorry, multitasking is destroying my neural capacity. The second question was skills, expected skill level.
Yes.
This is the thing about micro-credentials. We're not treating everybody as novices. So if you know something about the topic, you will be able to move fast through the content. If you don't know anything about the topic, we will build that capacity and we'll present those ideas.
Okay. And are you separating out badges for people with different starting skill levels, or because it sounds like you're not doing that?
No. So it's just the different skill, the different starting levels for competency will translate into faster or slower completion rates, speeds of completing the badges. But the badges have the same.
So I can be just a regular old person off the street who's interested in this sort of thing and start.
Yeah, Yes, and I should say, I was hoping that some of these will come up, and I see some of that on the Q&A. Are we expanding this program? Certainly. So we have right now a pilot program for Fred data blogging that we are piloting with the interns at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis this summer. So we have 30 plus interns developing the skills related to blogging about Fred data, and the end outcome of that is hopefully guest contributions to the Fred blog that we publish twice a week from the research division. We're also working with nonprofit, with the nonprofit sector, designing badges that allow individuals to recognize and identify the diversity in economic data. So we're using the same frame of sending micro-credentials to reach other constituencies.
Have you had any feedback from employers about these micro-credentials?
Not these ones specifically. That's a longitudinal question, right? So you have to launch them, people need to complete them, and then we need to hear back from them. We have an evaluation effort underway where we're gonna do focus groups with a number of parents who have completed these badges. And we wanna hear from them about, do they report this work as part of their annual professional development goals? Do they report does this count as an achievement in their annual workflow? We would love to hear if there are increases in compensation. Hey, we are economists after all, so does it pay off to spend time doing this? From other fields, we know.
Does it help them?
Case.
Does it help them get the job?
I mean, if anybody's familiar with Amazon Web Services and their foundational skill set and how this is offered to basically anybody who wants to take that, and then you pay for the certificate for the test to receive the certification, it's exactly the same idea, and it does certainly pay off if you're a web developer, if you have the AWS certification. So is that the same? Can we do the same thing for data literacy skills?
Right. Do you know, does Credly have like good integration with the job sites like LinkedIn? Like if I'm an employer, can I go say, I want people that have these particular skills, and like it'll match on those kind of credentials?
One of the reasons that we chose Credly as a platform, and this is not an endorsement of Credly in any way, shape, or form, is that it's integrated with our Canvas instance. So again, this is not an endorsement of Canvas in any way, shape, or form, but it's a nice thing for us if we can have the instruction on one side, the badging on the other side, and they can talk to one another without us having to go in and manually, reporting things or reinventing the wheel. So yes, there is a very good integration between LinkedIn and, for example, and Credly.
And if people want the course, they have to go to where you're hosting it right now. So Joel asks in the chat, are you planning to publish on other platforms? I'm guessing he's thinking things like edX or Coursera or places like that.
Right. No, at this point, it is hosted through our own instance of Canvas. So confusion that we get from time to time is, if you already are a user of Canvas in your school, do you already have access to the course itself? No, you have to register in our instance before you can launch the course.
Right. My kids have their own Canvas instance, and I through the elementary, it's the learning management system for the local elementary school and middle school.
Oh, I thought your own kids were running. They were the admins.
Oh, they run their own. Yeah, they've got their own micro-credentialing program that they're running. So you can learn things like skills like painting rocks or setting up a badminton net. Yeah,
they're that age. They're not into TikTok yet. Just wait.
Well, what's funny is they do actually spend a fair amount of time on YouTube watching other kids teaching videos. So this is a whole world I didn't know even existed, but like kids are totally teaching each other through YouTube.
That's awesome. As long as they don't spend a lot of time watching other people paint rocks as opposed to them paint rocks, that's
Yeah.
where we start
Yeah, yeah.
losing.
So just yesterday, my daughter was watching a video of somebody doing something in Minecraft. And I said, are you just watching that, or are you getting ideas for what you're going to do? And she looked at me, rolled her eyes, and said, no, of course not. I'm being inspired to do my own work. I said, oh, you've been listening to me too often on my Zoom meetings.
That's the correct answer. Good.
It was the correct answer. It was I'm not sure it was the honest answer, but it was definitely the correct answer. All right, so we're getting word from Thomas that he's here, but his laptop has died. Oh, but he needs to be made a host. I think once he's made a host, he might be able to actually rejoin. Oh, he's now a host.
Oh, perfect.
Hey, he's back.
Perfect. Apologies for that all. Shows one story you can never is always uncertain is your laptop dying and we wait for the presentation.
I tell you, Thomas, we didn't have any tech difficulties on day 1 or day 2, but
Oh,
this
there
is
you go.
like the
You
sixth.
save the worst till last then, obviously.
It's wild. We're so close. It's the third reviewer.
Okay. Well, I'll pick off where I left off then, I guess, because that's the best place to set with. And apologies for that. But as I was just saying before, my laptop failed on me. Setting monetary and financial stability at the Bank of England, stories are critical to that, and understanding what the economy is doing is critical to those stories. And so being able to say what is going on and why it's going on most crucially matters, because to set policy, we need to know that and be able to communicate policy to our ultimate stakeholders, which is the people of the United Kingdom. That is crucial. So stories play a role in all aspects of that chain. And here is a very busy slide, which I'm not going to go through all in detail, but what I wanted to do is to get across the breadth in terms of what the Bank of England, in my case, but with central banks such as the Fed, and as Diego has mentioned, but also, any institution will have multiple functions. For the bank, it ranges from, as I kind of mentioned, monetary stability on that far left to even storing gold in our vaults. But crucially, stories are interwoven across all of these functions, and ensuring that the narratives we're telling, the stories we're telling, both internally in terms of our work and in terms of our seniors, and also externally to the public, to financial markets, is effective. For those stories to be effective, they need to be joined up, they need to be consistent, they need to tell or all sing from the same hymn sheet. We can't be telling one story on where the economy is going in terms of setting monetary policy, but then also saying something different or out of whack in financial stability. Having stories when you grow up, different stories. As a child, I have a 5-month-old who loves hearing different stories at the moment. But when you're working in economics, you've got to make sure that if you're working in an institution, that those stories ultimately will adhere to one larger narrative. So how to create an effective narrative economic story? From my experience, it consists of 3 C's. The first is coherent. By this, I mean, any story needs to be logical, needs to have order, needs to be aesthetically consistent. In other words, it needs to make sense and be easy to understand. I think in terms of a lot of our work that we do in terms of students, so everything we're taught, quite rightly so, has strong academic rigor, strong analytical rigor, has to be underpinned by strong foundations. But ultimately, and as kind of already come across in this session, what you're saying needs to make sense. It needs to make sense logically from what we learn in terms of our theory. It needs to make sense in terms of how you're communicating. It's the words you're using, right? How much jargon are you using, for example? The second C is consistent. Again, I've kind of touched on this bit, and it kind of links to coherence. But in terms of being consistent, it means it needs to be a narrative, or a story needs to be uniform in terms of its content and conscious to other stories. As I've already kind of alluded to on the previous slide, being able to tell one story, both even in our institution, for example, from my experience working on understanding where the UK economy was going in terms of its growth outlook, for one quarter using a set of data, I need to be, as part of creating that story, as part of that analysis, I need to be cognizant of what my colleagues are doing in terms of what stories or analysis they're working on, because eventually when we present it to our policy committee, our senior stakeholders, they need to understand what these two stories, these two narratives, are they consistent? Do they make sense? How do I think about them as a policymaker together? And so this consistency really boils down to, can your story stack up against other stories, and how do they interact? Third and finally, it needs to be concise. Often in life, as many of you kind of aware, our time spans are very limited, and that goes for economics in the real world, kind of in addition to whether you tweet on the Twitter sphere. You've got to be concise. And concise doesn't mean just reducing the number of characters or words you're putting your story in. Again, there's different forms of communication. So being concise can be to the point in terms of presentations, for example, so getting to your key messages of your story, your key bottom lines up front, not letting your senior stakeholder or reader wait. I know kind of in my early teachings of economics, you're always given an essay question, and often in terms of some exams, you would have to go through all the type of underpinnings, how you got to your answer. But when it comes to economics in the real world, you know, everyone wants that underpinnings, but you need to give that answer up front. You need to answer the question directly and then give the appropriate background. So being concise also means thinking about how you form your stories and how you form the message of your stories and tailor it to your audience. So those are the 3 C's that I've abided to or found that have worked well, but how to go about it actually when you're constructing what I would call this triple C narrative. The first is building the narrative, and to build a narrative, you need the analysis to actually underpin to give you a story. And as already Rose alluded to with her example, you know, kind of using a range of sources, tools, or methods. In my case, in my job at the Bank of England, that's using quantitative data. So whether that's been data on the real economy or whether in financial markets, but also looking at qualitative data as well. So kind of more survey-based measures, but also speaking to people in financial markets, for example, to understand how they're seeing or what their perspectives are, what stories have they heard, which can help inform my story. Analytics, again, underpins and wraps and is key to all of this. So using the tool, whether it be, as Douglas mentioned, you know, whether your T statistics, using your regression, using your vector auto-regressive models, all of those tools are instrumental in order to be able to construct that economic narrative. So that's stage 1. Stage 2 is challenging, testing, and refining your narrative. Often, this is something I found quite starkly when you go into the real world of economics, is producing a brilliant bit of analysis is good, but that's not enough. A brilliant bit of analysis that is effective in terms of what it wants to do can be challenged, and you can have rebuttals to those challenges. You should always test and refine them, adapting your work, adapting your models, your thinking, your story is only a good thing. And really what you want to be able to do is to have an economic narrative, an economic story based in your underlying analysis that can be robust to whatever punches are thrown, whether that be from in the classroom, your lecturer, your tutor, to in the real world, your manager or other senior stakeholders. Third and finally, so you're equipped with that robust economic narrative. Now you have that narrative, you have that story, you have that analysis. What do you need to do in order to make it effective? Well, you need to understand your target audience first and foremost. Again, whether if that's for a lecturer or for whether that's a tutor, you know that there's a certain format or way that they would want to present it. But whether it's for a manager or senior stakeholder who may be competing with a lot of different priorities, thinking a lot about, you know, different policy decisions they have to make, you need to think about how you can best tell that story in a way that will get it across most effectively. An example from my experience has been when communicating a piece of work to our monetary policy committee in the UK and in the Bank of England has been. They're very technically minded. They're, you know, experts in a range of fields, and so being able to provide them with the analytical underpinnings of my work was important. But I could leave that, say, for example, in terms of an annex, in terms of a paper that I put to them, because the first and foremost they want to understand my key messages, how that fits into the broader policy environment, the broader stories that have been going on, or other bits of analysis, in order that I could tell my piece of work or my narrative effectively to my audience. So that would be the third and final stage. And so very lastly, before I end, or hopefully my laptop doesn't die before I can give my very few tips of wisdom, or what I would hope is wisdom from my experience in terms of creating economic stories in the world of work, is fourfold. So first, simplicity rather is the ultimate sophistication. So often kind of complexity, while when a student, and definitely I found it myself, you think the more complex thing you can do, the better it has to be. You're kind of going above and beyond. While that's still true kind of in terms of my day-to-day, in terms of my underlying analysis, so the tools and methods I'm using, complexity can often be the enemy of the good when trying to create a narrative, particularly at that end stage that I mentioned, when thinking about how you communicate it. You always want to bear in mind, once you've got that piece of analysis, you're starting to think about that narrative, how can you make it as simple as possible for your audience to understand? Because ultimately that's where your impact is going to be in terms of creating that story. Second, if it doesn't make sense, it's usually not true. This I've kind of learned in many harsh ways early on in my career, especially, is when you're always ensuring, particularly at that first stage, that you're questioning the underlying data analysis, and make sure that you really do that stage 2 by challenging yourself or others. You can often get into cases where you think you might have stumbled across something incredible which no one's ever seen before, and being able to make sure to really critically, robustly challenge that, and whether that be you as an individual or using your network in terms of your peers or your colleagues to be able to really test that view, I think is fundamental to creating a good economic narrative. And so as part of that process as well, it's often helpful to have informed priors to use as a yardstick when creating that narrative. So when you're using different modeling techniques, you should always go in there with some sort of prior of what you'd expect. And if it doesn't come out in a way you expect, then why is that? You should always be challenging in that case. Third, moving forward sometimes requires taking a step back. And this is something which I think is very acute, particularly when moving from the classroom to the working world, is it's very easy to often get bogged down in the detail and forget how your work, how that piece of work fits into the broader narrative, fits into that broader work of your institution, wherever it may be. And I think being able to take that step backwards, to be able to kind of look at the landscape where your work fits in, how can it best fit in, is where really, again, kind of from my experience and now also witnessing other people kind of come into the institution and do work, that's how those are the pieces that make most impact. And so explicitly, penciling in time when you're creating your narratives or economic stories, to get that perspective is helpful. I find that particularly at the start of doing a piece of analysis, that really helps, and towards the end when you're really thinking how it can make most impact. Fourth and finally, and I think quite a critical one, is it's okay to be wrong, but it's not okay to stay wrong. We all make mistakes. We'll all make mistakes in the classroom. I mean, indeed, I'm sure I see Cloda's in the line. She was quite adept at telling me and telling a colleague or telling my peers where we had made mistakes in our work. But the critical thing is, being wrong isn't a bad thing. It's often a mark of an effective narrative if what you've done is wrong, but you've adapted it, or if something goes opposing to what you thought might happen. For example, in my previous roles, I would forecast the UK economy, and obviously forecasting for some is a fool's game, and things will change. Shocks will hit the economy that we can't predict. There are unknown unknowns, and so being able that you can adapt your narrative or adapt your story to explain what has gone on or why maybe something was missed, I find is really important, because being able to rationalize if the story doesn't play out exactly how you might plan is fundamental to ensure that you have a good process to create those stories, and those stories keep evolving to make sure that there is the best stories that they can possibly be to impact whether you're in the private sector, public sector, or any form of economic life. So thank you for listening, and thank you for bearing with me through those technical difficulties, and I look forward to the panel discussion.
That was fantastic, Thomas. Thank you. And I find that like tech difficulties and making mistakes in class, it kind of humanizes you, and then your students are more willing to make mistakes, and they're more patient with me and patient with themselves when things go wrong. So yeah, no worries at all. We have a lot of good questions here. both from the panel, and because the panel can't actually use the Q&A, and also in the Q&A. And I think most of these questions actually, I think, apply to all of you. So let me throw this first one out there from Joel. So we're told often that data science is soon going to be the only game in town. And I think it depends how if you have a broad view of data science, sure, I agree with that. And so we have to teach our students how to write code. But are there other skills? So I think a lot of students graduate with an economics degree not being able to write code, and that's bad. And we've talked some about presentation skills. How important do you think writing code is, and having good presentation skills and good writing skills? And how important are those skills? And are there other skills that we're also missing out on that we should be teaching our students before we release them? Maybe you could start, Thomas.
Yeah, I think it's a really, really good question. And I think, if you asking, or whoever in the audience was asking this question maybe 10 years ago, coding and other skills wouldn't even be on the agenda. I mean, a couple of things kind of from my perspective, would be great to hear Rose and Diego as well. I think in terms of teaching students different perspectives and skills, I think having that diversity, whether it be, not just from a social science background, but, understanding things that maybe stuff that we in the profession would not consider necessarily to be economic, is kind of crucial. I mean, one really crucial example today, which is quite obvious, is say climate change, where you only have to look anywhere to find that people are more in the economics and finance profession are trying to understand the science behind climate change. And I think it's one of these things that having a more diverse mindset in terms of your students, so whether it's even as part within the classroom, students trying to go out of their way to look at different real world examples to understand how can I apply an economic concept to this, and speaking to the experts in another field can only make you as an individual, as an economist, more robust and resilient in terms of having that diversity of thought and approach to be able to then approach any type of kind of economic issue that might come before you in the real world.
So Rose, I want to give you a chance to answer this question too. But I have a fair amount of experience teaching at liberal arts institutions. And so I'm actually a huge fan of liberal arts, and Yale is, I think, is a pretty good liberal arts institution. And so you have to take all these other classes besides outside of economics. How valuable do you think that is? Because I used to think that this was common, and it turns out that like liberal arts education is a fairly American thing.
Yeah, it's funny. One of my friends wants to start a school in the UK that provides a liberal arts education. I think that my appreciation of my liberal arts education has increased over time. I think coming out, of undergrad, it's like, wow, I felt like I was allowed to learn anything as long as it wasn't useful in the real world. Was not useful in the real world. I joked that we could only learn things that were useless. But I think a couple of things that have emerged over time. One is writing. And, I think that as a data scientist, having some baseline level of ability to code is really important. But that will never be the thing that differentiates you. You will never be as good at coding as a software engineer is. And it's good to have the basics to do your job and to communicate with engineers, but it will never be the thing that differentiates you. I think that, being someone who can use data to answer questions, no matter how complex or simple the question or the methodology may be, and then being able to communicate that to everyone and get everyone on board with your view, which that typically involves way more communication skills, which if you decompose like what that is, that's actually, speaking, writing, and just understanding your audience. And I think the English classes that I took in undergrad, as well as, you know, a lot of different like history classes where we had to write, or, you know, after you leave undergrad, no one will really bother to teach you to write. Like no one's going to take their red pen and scribble over your essay. And so I do think that undergrad is, and the liberal arts curriculum is, what it teaches you is to put on different hats. And I found that to be very helpful. Like, you know, if you have a hammer, everything is a nail. And so like, if you have different types of tools that you can draw from, like, is this a problem where like my analysis is just not rigorous enough and I need to go back and do more data analysis? Or is this a problem where my analysis is fine and it's actually the person isn't understanding it and I need to think about how to communicate it in a different way? And being able to figure out like what is appropriate when, and having that judgment, it's helpful. Like the more, as Thomas said, the more diverse the skill sets and tools you can draw from, the more you can answer the question or solve the problem in like the most straightforward way, as opposed to some convoluted way, because, you know, all you have is a hammer. And so, you know, and I've seen that quite a bit where, you know, if a machine learning engineer comes in with their hammer, which is the prediction method, and it's a causal inference problem, things can go very wrong very quickly. And so I find just having a diverse toolkit and having your main thing, which for me is analyzing data, for someone else it may be coding, but then also having those other hats that you can put on as needed, it makes you much more effective than just having the technical skills.
So that's a good segue to this other question I had, which is it, how important are machine learning skills today? Should all economics departments be offering a machine learning course? Should we be pushing our students to take machine learning courses in other departments? Should it be a requirement of the major? Diego, do you have any thoughts on this, kind of given your experience at the Fed? Like, are machine learning methods used throughout the Fed now, or not so much?
Certainly. I mean, that's a skill that is very much in demand. Should it be required for everybody? Yes and no. Not everybody, I mean, yeah,
you're such an economist, Diego.
There are specialization fields within economics, right? So people should be able to choose if they need that skill or not. I've always said that if you want to do cutting edge work in economics and you want to do that based on an original data set, you better know a little bit about data and about how data can be extracted and what is possible and what is not. So as an economist, you will find yourself tied to a data scientist who can get those data for you. And if you flip that around, the moment that data scientist starts getting some of the basic tools of economic analysis that we just passed through during the undergraduate major, I think the odds of those professionals taking over some of the stuff that economists are doing right now are pretty high.
Got it. Thomas, do you have any thoughts on machine learning?
I think I pretty much agree with Diego. I mean, I think it's one of those things that it's a tool that's being, altering some landscape, kind of, not, kind of across the economics profession to some degree, but there's an element of it, and I think the storytelling is a good thing. There's obviously limitations with machine learning, that's from what I understand in any case, that it can produce something, but being able to tell that, if I use it, say, just to use to my example, how would you tell if you're in the public sector, you have made a decision based on a machine to change someone's, for example, their either fiscal or monetary policy just solely? I'm not saying that that's the case, but I think, you do get into how do you use the tool, I think is the better question. And I think, to Diego's point, is about having that skill set as part of, your organization or collective, rather than necessarily just the individual.
Yeah, I think Joel makes a really good point, which is, even if you don't think machine learning is appropriate in lots of cases, you need to know it so you can argue against it.
Yeah.
And that's actually an argument I use for a lot of students that say, I don't want to take economics because I don't believe that all markets are perfectly competitive. And then I say, well, you're right. You can still take economics even if you don't think all markets are perfectly competitive. And you will learn the vocabulary that you need to argue against these like kind of folks that argue about the ubiquity of perfectly competitive markets. So you're going to need to communicate with those people. I think that makes a lot of sense. So Annika has a question in the chat, with the Q&A. She kind of addresses it to Rose, but I think I'd be curious to what everyone has to say about this. It's hard to convince students of the importance of being able to communicate with people outside economics. Do you have any suggestions for how we could convince our students that that's an important skill? Beyond inviting you into the classroom to give a talk to our students.
Well, I think that's kind of ironic, right? Because I always understood the highest mark of achievement for an economist or for an economic argument is that it is transformed into policy. So it influences people's behavior. So if you cannot communicate the importance of your argument, is the proverbial tree that falls in the forest and there's no one around. So, intellectual breakthrough without communication is meaningless. So I don't see how is it difficult to convey to students that you have to be able to talk about your economic arguments.
Thomas, do you think it's self-evident?
I think to a degree. I think there's obviously there's a kind of, there's a rationale behind, I think, why one might be like that. But I think well, one, wholeheartedly agree with Diego. I mean, I think it's, in a way, being able to teach a student that shouldn't be the way, or that isn't a way, an effective economist should operate is one thing. But I think just to link it back to something Rose said at one of the previous questions, I think maybe, one way or one aspect is, encouraging students, in this case being the economics profession, to really, dip their toes and actually experience other studies, other areas of studies, because I think from that they'll realize, if you're speaking, I mean, just to use for an example, if they did flirted with biology, for example, you would go in there and realize how can I even communicate to these individuals, or how can I link up what I'm doing with what they're doing? Sometimes there's overlap, sometimes they're not. And so I think being able, and universities are the best place to do this. You have all the brilliant young minds, all from different fields. And I think being able to really, use that to the ability that students can communicate to each other, I think is critical if they want to be able to effectively communicate to the in the real world.
Thomas, there's a couple questions in the chat that I'm going to combine, and that is, can you give us an example of a story you've told where you really humanized it? So a story where you told that it wasn't just, well, these numbers say this thing. I don't know. This question reminds me a lot of a quote. I don't remember the source, but it was when 1,000 people die, it's a statistic. Well, no, when one person dies, it's a tragedy. When 1,000 people die, it's a statistic. And I think that it is important to kind of get that human element in there and not just tell stories that are purely numbers. Have you found that in your work?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I think one example I would give, and which is slightly left field, and I left it out of my introduction, was I worked as part of the at the UK Finance Ministry's independent government review on the economics of biodiversity, otherwise known as the descriptor review. And a big part of that review, was kind of in a way taking a step back from looking at the statistics and the numbers and really thinking about economics in the context of the natural world. And you couldn't shy away from humanizing it, because I think when you get into stuff that again is more from that nature perspective or that naturalist perspective, you're starting to think about things such as consumer preferences in a very different way, or you're starting to think about the limits to economic activity within, you know, the biosphere or the natural world or the planet we live on. And so I think by sometimes the subject matter just lends itself to being a bit more human. But then I think in other senses, you know, it's a bit harder, but that's one example. I hope that does.
No, it's good. Diego, you wanted to say something too.
No, I thought you were gonna go with the Eddie Izzard line about, you know, you kill some people, bad for you. You kill thousands, well done.
It's a little too close to home these days. All right, so we've only got about 5 minutes left, and I'm gonna ask a question that I think is a little bit off topic, but I'm gonna ask it anyway because I've got these people from the real world here. How important is teamwork? Because my students, everyone pretty often actually, I'll put them into a group and say they have to work as a team, and they'll say, I hate working in a team. I prefer to work alone. And I do lots of things to kind of make sure that things are kind of credit is properly apportioned. But if I would like to hear from each of you just how prevalent working in a team is and how important it is that students have some experience with this before they get here, before we release them. Rose, maybe you can start. Sorry.
Oh, just I will be brief. I mean, any conversation that starts with in the real world,
Yeah.
if the university is not the real world, we are just shooting ourselves in the foot. I mean, that's not, if we keep on insisting on that dichotomy between what happens outside of the classroom and what happens in the classroom being two different realms, I don't think we're helping our students. And
well, I mean, it is pretty darn different. For instance, they pay to be in the classroom, but they get paid to be in the real world. Now,
okay.
We should connect the two way more than we do, but they're pretty different.
Okay, well, we'll not go there. The thing about the presence of teamwork, I mean, one joke that it became very personal very quickly in the Federal Reserve, working for the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, is that once you become an employee, you will never send an email to solely one person ever again. Everything that I email to is copied to someone else because you're never doing anything by yourself. So that's my.
Yeah. Okay. Rose?
I think when I reflect on my undergrad experience, one of the things I learned so much from was this conference I've organized as part of one of my extracurriculars. And I had to manage a team of people, and we were planning it for a year. And yeah, I think that I also I empathize with the students because I hated group work when I was in undergrad. But interestingly, you know, every project I have now is group work, and it has very similar echoes of the struggles of group work in undergrad, where maybe not everyone is on the same page about how hard we're going to work on this project. And, you know, some people are really diligent about completing everything on time, and other people are dragging their feet. And so, you know, I think the students just don't like it because it's hard. But then when you go into the real world, you have to do it, and it's still hard, but it's your job. When I reflect back on my undergrad experience, I think one thing I didn't have a lot of that I would have liked more of is what are the jobs and career paths that are available to economics majors, and what do you need to do to succeed in those jobs? I think I was aware of investment banking consulting at my time. You know, data science hadn't become a huge thing yet. But even though I know those roles existed because I saw that's where people were doing internships, I don't think I knew what you needed to succeed in those roles and what types of skills. And so I think if I were an undergrad, I would be much more motivated to engage in these more difficult elements of the curriculum, like group work, explaining things to people who aren't economists. Like, students don't want to do it because it's hard and they find it annoying and they think it's pointless. But if I were able to better connect as a student, these are the things that I am doing in the classroom. And this is how it connects to skills that people in the real world use. And it may not even be profession specific, right? Like communication and teamwork is kind of this general thing that's very prevalent in a lot of different industries. But somehow like making that connection more explicit would have helped motivate me as an undergrad.
That's really great. Joel in the chat says that he has this information, I think, about how these skills are, what skills are rewarded in the real world on the third slide of his Econ 101 class. Joel, can you send me that slide? I think I need to incorporate it into my slides. Thomas, I'm going to let you have the last word on this, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay. Well, I think Diego and Rosa made some really good point. I mean, I think what I would probably just add, maybe just to end it, and I think it's great in a way because we have all the people listening in from the world of academia. I think really kind of it comes down to values, and it's in terms of what do we want our students to be. And I think in part of that we've touched on, collaboration, I guess inclusion. These are values that, when you go into the working world, you need to have, or that should be, kind of essential if you want to be an effective economist, an effective individual, an effective person kind of through any walks of life. And so I think in a way, this is something that can be solved by how do you teach the student, what type of values do you want them to embody in terms of their work. And I think there was a question in the chat about how do we prepare students to fail. And I think it wraps into this, is that in a way, what we should be aiming is to have, you want to be able to produce students that are most importantly resilient to the real world, so that they can cope with failure. And I think that's something that would underpin all of this. But resilience you can build from being collaborative, from being inclusive. And I think that's where it starts. It starts from the classroom, and it starts from all the people listening in to be able to give those values to their students.
I am so glad that this session's being recorded, because I so want to take like these like big chunks of what all three of you have been saying and like play them for my students, and frankly like rewatch them myself and like get more kind of excited about and inspired to make positive changes to my classes based on this. And with all sincerity, thank you so much for contributing to this and giving us a window into what the world that's not college, can I say that, Diego? The world that's not college is actually is like, thank you. We've got one more piece of the conference left, and that is the Stata sponsored mixer. And I encourage everyone to come, especially if you have more questions about this panel. Hopefully the panelists will join us, and hopefully the presenters from the earlier session can join us too. Thank you, everyone. And if you're not going to be at the panel, thank you for attending the session, and really appreciate it. All right.
Thank you.
That's a wrap. Thank you, everyone.